The church I attend has a daily Bible reading, and today it actually fell on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. And after I read that this morning, the Lord just began to drop some things into my heart about it. And the interesting thing about the Sermon on the Mount, it's one of those many things in the Bible that commentators get the opposite message of what Jesus is actually teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. So this is kind of going to be an overview. We'll see how well it goes, and we may go from here, may not. And you're going to realize we're reading from Matthew. So Matthew is a primarily Jewish audience. So you have to kind of put on the head or get inside the head of a Jewish reader whenever you read Matthew. So the fact that Jesus is ministering on a mountain is supposed to hyperlink you back to Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the law. I actually prefer Torah, but people don't know what you're talking about. It's actually Torah. Law, we kind of get a misunderstanding of what law is. Torah means instruction. That's what, if you read in the Old Testament, it's Torah. It means instruction. So it's law in the sense like the law of gravity. It's how things work. It's instruction on how life operates. It's life principles. So, but anyway, so we're to see Jesus as another Moses. Deuteronomy 18:18 says, I will raise up from them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak them all things I command him. So Deuteronomy 18:18 prophesied another Moses is coming. And this is even illustrated by, you see events that happen in the life of Moses that happened to Jesus. There was a group of men outside the camp prophesying, and there was two guys inside the camp prophesying, and Joshua, who was Moses' right-hand man, runs in and says, we need to forbid them because they're not with us. They're not in the right place. They're not with the right place with the right people to be doing this. And Moses said to him, Numbers 11:29, are you jealous for my sake? I would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. Now, he was actually prophesying of a time that would come where Joel talks about the Spirit of God would be poured out on all flesh. Young men shall see visions. The old men will dream dreams. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. So in other words, visions and dreams, if you compare that with Numbers, is prophet language. He said, if I speak to a prophet, I'll speak through visions and dreams. So that's prophet language. So he said, there's a day coming when the spirit that was just on the prophets will be democratized, and everybody will have access to what just the prophet has. Now, that don't mean in the New Testament sense everyone is a prophet. They are the prophet of their own life. In other words, they have the ability to hear for themselves, but that don't mean they're a prophet in the sense of the fivefold ministry gift. But Moses said, are you jealous for my sake? This is kind of a sidebar, but this kind of separates the people who love the truth from those who are building their own kingdom. People want to have their own little niche thing, and they don't want anybody else intruding into the same thing that they're doing. Yet if you're building the kingdom, Paul says, some people are preaching the gospel just to add to my misery. But he says, I rejoice that the gospel is preached, because Paul wasn't preaching his own kingdom. What the Lord has called me to do is study the original languages, Greek, and also the historical context behind it. And I'm trying to learn. I'm kind of learning Hebrew right now, but it's kind of going slowly because there's no standardized font in Hebrew, so it's So anything you look at looks different. And the little thing like font will throw you off when you're learning a little new language. But I only say that to say, I wish everyone were Greek scholars. Because I've observed something. The big fish in a small pond thing doesn't work very well. I've seen where someone has a great understanding of the Greek and they're among a group that doesn't emphasize those things. And because there's nobody there to check them, they get sloppy. I wish for my sake that after I would minister a message, someone would come up to me and say, hey, you said, that was first, you said that was aorist, but it was actually imperfect, I wish that would happen because that's what keeps you sharp. So in my mind, whether it's true or not, I assume, especially, when you're doing videos like this that goes over the big old internet webs, chances are there's people that do know these things. So I assume that everybody that hears me is going to be checking on me, and that's how I keep myself sharp. But also, we don't need to be territorial in our ministry. There's one guy said, if you're not one of my spiritual sons, you can't preach my message. Well, what are you wanting to do? Are you wanting to advance the kingdom, or are you wanting to build your kingdom? But the point is, there was people prophesying that Moses, right-hand man, and those that are around Moses thought shouldn't be, so they come to hush him up. And Moses said, no, allow him. Jesus, in Luke 9:49 and 50, Master, said John, who's Jesus' right-hand man, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us. He didn't go to our Bible school. He shouldn't be able to do this. Well, don't stop him, Jesus said, for whoever is not against you is for you. So we see even parallel events in the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. So that signals to us that they are parallel figures. They are both figureheads. Moses is the figurehead of of the law. Jesus is the figurehead of the new covenant. Elijah is the figurehead of the non-writing prophets. Whenever Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, you had Moses and Elijah with him. And they were having a council. John 1:17, I want to read it in the King James because I want to show you where King James fouls it up. Not knocking the King James, and just in this case he did. It says, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. If you read in your King James, you'll see that the but is in italics. So King James inserts a prosthetic but in this verse that don't go there. And it totally fouls up and totally makes you miss the point. So people historically have contrasted, law gave Moses, was given by Moses, icky, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. But that's, once again, that is the opposite message of this verse. Here it is in its context and outside of King James. This is the NIV. Out of his fullness we have received grace in place of the grace already given. So that means this is going to qualify that verse. The law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So we have received grace in place of the grace already given. So Moses gave the first act of grace through the giving of the law. The giving of the law was an act of grace. I've covered that in previous lesson ad nauseum, so I'm not going to go through and rehash that. So Jesus is adding to the grace that was already given in Torah or in the law. He's bringing it to another level because the act of redemption is progressive. Romans 1:16 and 17, common verse, but once again, we miss this because we pull it out of this context that we're talking about. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. So what are we talking about? To the Jew first, also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, The righteous shall live by faith. From is ek, out of, ace, into. So it's out of faith, into faith. Out of the faith of the old covenant system. Why? Because Jew first, into the Greek. That's what he's talking about. Jew to the Gentile. So there is a system that comes out of the Old Testament faith system that carries on into the New Testament faith system. So from the faith of Moses and the prophets into the faith of Jesus. The NIV says it's the righteousness that is faith from first to last. Romans 3:20, or 3:30 rather. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. And that's the way it reads in the Greek. There's a definite article. Whenever you have the same word mentioned in the same verse, faith, and the first faith doesn't have the definite article, so sometimes translated the or this, and then the second one does have it. We know that it's called an anaphoric. It's an anaphoric article, which means it's pointing back to the previously mentioned. So he will justify the circumcised, or the Jewish people, the first covenant people. He justified them by faith. And the uncircumcised will be justified through that same faith that reached its full strength in Jesus. Because that's what it was all pointing to. Matthew 5:17 through 19. This is leading in. Of course, we had the Beatitudes. I'm not going to go through all the blesseds. It'll bless you to read that. Pun slightly intended. But you go through it and read all the Beatitudes. But what I'm trying to do is trying to hit some of the high spots of some of the things that are misunderstood. So, he gives the blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are you when they persecute you, and all these other things. But I want to start with verse 17 when he goes into the next part. Because the next part where he says, you have heard it said, but I say. You've heard it said, but I say. But you can't go into that before you read this part. This part sets it up. And so if you get the opposite message of this, then you're interpreting incorrectly. Matthew 5:17 through 19. Do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. This is the opposite of how people approach the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, you've heard it said, but I say. They say it's Jesus thumbing his nose at the law, like Jesus is a problem child that is rebellious against his father. His father gave the law, but he's out here, he's kind of like the CEO's son that sells off the business and buys a fireworks stand or something like that. That Jesus is this rebellious hippie. But no, but first of all, we have to determine what does destroy and fulfill in its original context. Destroy and fulfill in its original context, if two rabbis were discussing Torah, they were discussing the law, and Rabbi A disagrees with Rabbi B, Rabbi A will say, you are destroying the law. And Rabbi B will respond, no, I'm not destroying the law. I am fulfilling the law. What that means, it's an idiom. An idiom is kind of like, he hit the ceiling. We have all kinds of idioms like that. Whereas the sum don't equal its parts. It's a figure of speech used in a certain context. Destroy the law means to interpret incorrectly. That's what it meant in this context. So Jesus says, I'm not come to interpret the law incorrectly. I've come to interpret it correctly. To fulfill means to interpret it correctly, and to interpret and imply it correctly. So Jesus is not doing away with it. He's not thumbing his nose at it, which And like I said, most commentaries teaches the very opposite of this. They say, yes, that's exactly what he's doing. He's thumbing his nose and saying how icky it was. But now grace is awesome, and that was icky. So Jesus says, I come to interpret the commandments correctly. So whenever he goes into, you've heard it said, but I say, he's saying this was how they interpreted it incorrectly. They were actually destroying it by interpreting incorrectly. But I say this is what the spirit of the law is. This is what the spirit behind the commandment is. See, part of the reason is they think that, that the law is the opposite of love, when the New Testament teaches the very opposite. Paul says in Galatians, he that loves fulfills, what do we say fulfillment? Means interprets correctly the law. So the whole purpose of the law was to demonstrate the love of God. And Jesus, of course, and that's not to say that Jesus didn't bring it up. Yes, he did, but it was progressively being brought up throughout the whole of Scripture. I'll give you one example. Jesus says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, if somebody, strikes you on the right hand, on the right cheek, offer the other. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it before me. I didn't actually plan to get into it this far. And people say, see, Jesus is doing away with the law. Well, actually, the scholars call that the lex talionis, the eye for an eye. That commandment in its day was revolutionary because there was a law code called Hammurabi's Code I think it was the Babylonians, and it had the same commandment, eye for an eye. However, the eye of a noble was worth more than the eye of a peasant. But in Torah, God's commandment applies to everyone. So he was taking something in their culture and bringing them up. And another thing about, there's three aspects to the law. There's the civil law, which governs them as a nation, just like we have civil laws, speed limits, and things like that. Then there is the moral law, which is the Ten Commandments, which are eternal. Then you have the ceremonial law, which is like the sacrifices, the sacrificial system, and all these things. So the civil law wasn't meant to be an end-all be-all. The civil law was God meeting the people where they were, and through relationship bringing them up. So it wasn't, the eye for an eye wasn't, even though it was revolutionary for its day. And also, it was a limitation. It was set as a limitation as well. Some people, if they gouge out your eye, they would respond by gouging out both of their eyes and killing their mule and burning their house down. It's a limiter. It's saying you cannot, the punishment cannot exceed the crime. And honestly, they didn't carry it out literally. Like, if this guy gouged out this guy's eye, they would gouge out his eye. They would assign a monetary value, and he would have to recompense that guy that. So, but it wasn't God's best, because that was the civil law. It was just the laws that governed them as a nation to keep them from killing each other until the Messiah comes. And he could give them a new heart and replace the heart of stone with a heart of flesh, like Jeremiah says. It's funny, people make the new covenant and then they want to push all the Jewish people out of it and say, and then say the whole Jewish aspect of it's icky. Whenever he prophesied the new covenant, he says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Judah and the house of Israel. Now, thank God we are grafted in as Gentiles, but we got to remember we're the grafted in ones. We're not. There's a despicable teaching called replacement theology that says now God has cast aside the Jewish people and everything Old Testament's icky now. And that's where a lot of this error comes from. But anyway, but the point I'm making is the civil law wasn't meant to be an end-all, be-all. It wasn't even to legislate morality. It was just to put barriers around so people could function in civilized society without killing each other. But the moral law dealt with the heart. The moral law is eternal. The ceremonial law, of course, it divides into two categories. There is the Masereh HaTorah, the works of the law. That is the 613 commandments given to Israel as a nation that set them apart. The fringes on their garment, don't cut the edge of your beard, don't eat pork, and all these things that set them apart as a nation. But now Jesus broke down that middle wall of separation. So that's why Paul, when he talks about, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised, which is part of it, because he said if you accept circumcision, you are agreeing to keep all of those 613 commandments. And frankly, you can't do it because the Jewish people start out from when they're 5 years old, they begin to learn Torah. We can't come in as full-grown adult Gentiles, and try to cram these things in. That's why he gave us the Holy Spirit to write these laws on our hearts. But the point I'm making is that's the ceremonial law that applied the works of the law. And we find this in Dead Sea Scroll material. I'm not just making this up. In the Dead Sea Scroll material, it gives... So when you read Galatians, where it seems like Paul is speaking negatively of the works of the law, he's speaking of a certain aspect. If you read it in context, you see it's contrasting and saying you don't have to join yourself to the nation. It was a rabid nationalism, and it wasn't about now I'm free to commit adultery. That's not what it's about, because that's part of the moral law, which is eternal, which is part of the character of God. You read Galatians, and he talks about, when he's going to bat, this happens at the same time of the Jerusalem Council, where they were trying to decide, what do we do with these Gentiles? Well, they go to Leviticus. That's where they get their instruction. They go to the law to determine how they deal with it. And they said, well, they don't have to keep all the commandments. They keep the Noahide laws, don't eat blood, abstain from sexual immorality. And then there's the sacrificial system, which isn't done away with. Jesus just fulfilled it. All the sacrifices, everything in the sacrificial system, Jesus fulfilled it in his death, burial, and resurrection. He was both the priest and he was the offering. And he was all of these things that they offered up, all culminated into Jesus. And so that's why the writer of Hebrews is dealing with the ceremonial aspect or the sacrificial system. And that's why he says it's being done away with. Is because that part was fulfilled in Messiah. So, I didn't mean to get into it as detailed as I did, but use this as a template now. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, you have to read it through the lens of, don't think I've come to destroy through the law and the prophets, but I've come to fulfill them. I've come to interpret them correctly and teach you how to live properly out of those commands. And if you teach people to break these commandments, you're the least in the kingdom of heaven. Are we in the kingdom of heaven? Yes, we are. Anyway, well, thanks for watching. God bless.